I was born in Capitol, Louisiana. My parents were living there. My father was from St. Martinville, and my mother was from Opelousas. And I went to high school at Capitol High School, and started the second grade at age 5. Finished high school at age 15 and went to Southwestern in Lafayette. My father was one of the earliest inspirations. He had been a school teacher before he became a warehouseman, and he taught me how to read when I was very young. My father died when I was 8 years old. But I was very fortunate. I had several men who picked up and helped lead me along the way, all the way to where I am today. And fortunately, one was Alvin Rubin, by the way. But the nice thing about it is that I was able to appreciate what they did for me, and I ended up dedicating a book to each one of them. I was worried about the draft in those days, so I joined the National Guard in college, and I got drafted out of the National Guard and went to the Army for 2 years. I served in Germany for a year. Served in El Paso, Texas for a year, and Germany for a year. Some president, I forget who the president was announcing you could get out of the Army early if the war was over, Korean War was over, but you get out of the Army early if you could go back to school. Well, I'd already gone to college, but I wanted to get out of the Army. So I wrote Dean Hebert at LSU Law School, and he said, could you let me into law school so I can go get out of the Army? And he got me out of the Army by admitting me to law school. And so I became a lawyer to get out of the Army. I began practicing with a large law firm. One of the largest law firms in Baton Rouge, that's Alvin Rubin's firm at the time, Sanders, Miller, Downing, Rubin, and Keene. I practiced with them, made partner there. I left there, I went to the country and began practice with my uncle, who was a good country lawyer. I practiced there for 6 years. 6 years, made a lot of money. We did a lot of oil and gas work. I got involved in journalism and worked for the Lafayette Daily Advertiser, which is now in the news, as you know now. And incidentally, while I was practicing law in the country, they had a weekly newspaper which was pitiful. And I decided we needed a good weekly newspaper in this town, so I started a weekly newspaper of my own. And the thing I sold out later on. It's the Capitol and Herald is still publishing, by the way. And so I started a weekly newspaper, and ran a weekly newspaper while I practiced law for about 6 years. I decided I wanted to try teaching. I was doing well practicing law, but I wanted something more than that. And I called Dean Hebert, and I went and had a meeting with him, and he was not interested in me as a law professor. He said he didn't hire LSU graduates at that time. And I talked to Professor George Pugh. Professor George Pugh said, well, why don't you go get a graduate degree? I said, how can I get a graduate degree in law? He said, well, try different schools. And so I did, in fact, apply at Yale. I was admitted at Yale. And I was leaving Kaplan. The two Cajuns said, where's this fellow Maraist going? One said, he's going to Yale. One said, oh, what's he studying? I said, nothing, they're studying him. So I went to Yale to be studied for a while. And then after graduating from Yale graduate program, I began to teach law. When I was going to Yale, I was being taught by a law professor, visiting professor from the University of Texas, and I was taking the course with him, and he finally he took me back to the University of Texas to teach his course over there. So I taught at the University of Texas there. Then I went to Ole Miss. Then I taught at the Washington University, St. Louis. Taught at Tulane. Oh yeah, I was teaching in North Carolina, and Dean Hebert called me and said, "Okay, come back to LSU, teach." And he called me about 4 days before Christmas. I said, "You know, I don't really want to leave North Carolina. and I don't really want to go to LSU. But if I ever want to eat boudin again at Christmas time, I better go back to Louisiana. So boudin brought me back to Louisiana, and I taught there with some degree of success for 35 years. I taught at the National Judicial College in Reno many times. At the time I went into law teaching, in order to get tenure, you had to publish something. So I started by publishing articles in different publications. I started writing books, and I wrote several books, several publishers over the years. And I managed to write books in almost every course I taught. I began publishing a newsletter on recent developments in law. And one of those publications attracted the Frank Middleton, who was president of the LADC. And the only thing they had was just a regular newsletter telling people who did what, when, where. And they asked if I would write a little newsletter about recent developments in law for the LADC, and I started working for them. And after that, I became the executive director. And I was executive director for 25 or 30 years. When I started working for the LADC, we had about 200 or 300 members. When I retired, we had about 1,700 members. About the same time I began doing a little publication for the LADC, I was invited by the Supreme Court to talk about recent developments in a meeting, I think around Dorita or someplace they had. And I was going to go make a speech and there on some recent developments, but I got sick. Only time I've ever been sick in my life, that I couldn't make a meeting. And I forget who the executive director of the Supreme Court was at that time, but he said, too bad you couldn't have any notes. I said, I do have some notes. He said, well, send your notes. So I sent the notes that I had to give him, and they called back and said, look, the judges want your notes. And so I started writing for the judges at that time. But the most important recruiting I ever did was at the time when I first began teaching at Ole Miss. This was the time when there was a very strong anti-black feeling at Ole Miss. You remember those days, I began teaching at Ole Miss, and the outstanding black law professor I had there, I convinced him to try to teach, and he applied for teaching, and we hired him. We hired him as teacher, the first African American law professor ever at Ole Miss. This is only about 5 or 6 years after the big blow up, and they did a great job. He now, by the way, he went back to practice. He's now the mayor of Memphis, by the way. When I came to LSU, I had the same situation. No black professors at all. Sitting in my classroom, freshman classroom, was a young man named Eudis Simeon, an outstanding young man, and from Lake Charles, as I recall. And when he finished, I convinced him to try to teach, and he ended up applying for law teaching at LSU, and was first black or African American law professor at LSU. So I recruited those two people, the first black Afro-American law professors at LSU and Ole Miss. My best achievement. One important thing I did was I served as judge of the 19th Judicial District by special appointment from the Supreme Court. At that time, the Supreme Court needed somebody to replace somebody who was going out of office, and asked me to serve. And I arranged to where I could do that and not take any cut in pay. and I did that, so I served, I think, about 6 months or so as judge, mostly civil, some criminal, but mostly civil cases. I realized how many people who come to court are unhappy. And you as a judge had to cool the anger. And sometimes you had to cool the anger by finding them in contempt. So I didn't like that at all. But it was an interesting experience. On Admiralty nutshell, but I can't remember who the original. Somebody else was with me in the first one, and then dropped out, maybe, and I ended up finishing Admiralty in a nutshell. Hank and I were in school together at LSU. He was a year behind me. Very bright, very bright. He became a very outstanding judge. And he and I became good, we were always good friends. And when my daughter finished law school, she said, I said, you know, you could clerk for a federal judge. She said, I want to clerk for Judge Police. So I sent her resume to Hank, said, this young lady would like to clerk for you. Would you mind giving her an interview? And he calls my wife and says, tell your daughter, if she doesn't look like Frank, she got the job. So my bad looks got her a job with Hank, but we remained close friends all through the years. And we used to swap jokes by telephone on government funds, by the way. We swap jokes. And after a while, I started putting together some stories, and I asked him to join me. So together we put together books. My daughter was probably the second best student I ever taught. And she's been a very fine lawyer, and she is co-author with me on several books right now. Writing with Harry Lemon was very interesting. We wrote for the leading book, treatise on Louisiana civil procedure, and he wrote most of it. I first met him now at Southwestern. We were both at Southwestern together, and he was running the 100-yard dash, losing badly, but he went from there to become a very fine lawyer, law professor, and judge. I think I probably was decided to retire when it wasn't as much fun anymore. And I don't know why it wasn't so much fun. Partly, the students were not hungry as they used to be. And they did not work hard. It just wasn't fun anymore. Besides, I realized I was the second smartest lawyer in my family, and it was time to quit. And I retired from teaching, but I haven't retired from the law. I'm still very active in writing. He did his damnedest. I did the best I could have done under circumstances.